Vivian Cross invited me to dinner as a joke. Her assistant made the call, laughing before she finished the sentence, and I could hear a room of young executives laughing along in the background like it was already the funniest thing they'd heard all quarter. I was the 61-year-old nobody who fixed old houses for a living, the man somebody's niece had pointed at in a lobby and said, "Imagine if we sat him at the good table." I said yes before she finished, explaining why. I did not tell her that I already knew exactly what was wrong inside her company. I'd learned a long time ago that when people decide who you are before you open your mouth, correcting them rarely helps you. It only tells them you noticed. So when Priya Anand called on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice bright with a kind of amusement she wasn't bothering to hide, and said Miss Cross would be delighted to have me join Saturday's dinner at the Aldergate Room, I simply said I'd be there. I didn't ask why. I already understood why. Somebody needed a joke, and I had been standing close enough to become one. Vivian Cross was 29 years old and ran Northbridge Group the way some people run marathons, mostly to prove to themselves it could be done. I had crossed paths with her exactly once at a fundraiser 2 months earlier, where I'd been invited as a favor to an old client and had spent most of the evening near the coat check listening rather than talking. Someone in her circle, a young man named Bram who worked in her strategy office, had made a comment about the older gentleman by the window who looked like he'd wandered in from a hardware store. Vivian had laughed. I hadn't minded. I'd minded something else entirely, something none of them had noticed, which was the conversation happening 20 feet away between her uncle and a man from an outside firm, a conversation that used the wrong numbers on purpose. That was the night I decided I would accept an invitation if one ever came, not because I cared about being laughed at. I had made peace with that particular indignity decades before most of the people in that room had been born. I accepted because something in Richard Voss's voice, the careful way he'd corrected himself when he thought no one was listening closely, told me his niece's company had a problem she didn't know about yet. I have spent my life learning to hear that kind of thing. It has cost me things I don't discuss easily, even now, even with people I trust. I raised a daughter alone for 11 years, Renee, who is 34 now and lives 3 states away with a life I'm proud to have helped build. Somewhere in the raising of her, I made a decision that shaped everything after. I decided that the version of myself the world once knew, the one who used to walk into failing companies and rebuild them from the studs up, was a man I could no longer afford to be. Recognition had cost me something, once something I'd never fully explained to Renee, and I had chosen quiet ever since. But quiet is a choice you can only keep making as long as it doesn't cost someone else. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a man once he decides the world doesn't need to know what he's capable of. I lived inside that silence for the better part of 15 years, and I want to be honest about something. Most days, it didn't feel like sacrifice at all. It felt like relief. I worked with my hands, repaired old staircases and warped floorboards, spoke to people who had no reason to wonder what I used to be, and found something close to peace in being ordinary. The trouble with peace like that is it only holds as long as no one else's future depends on you breaking it. I remember the drive home from that fundraiser more clearly than the fundraiser itself. Renee had called partway through, just to check in the way she does most weeks, and I hadn't mentioned any of it. Not the joke, not Richard's careless arithmetic, not the small itch at the back of my mind that told me I'd stumbled onto something I couldn't unhear. I told her the food was decent and the company was forgettable, which was true enough. I have never lied to my daughter about anything that mattered. I have simply on occasion waited for the right moment to tell her the parts that weren't finished yet. Saturday came. I dressed the way I used to dress before I stopped needing to impress anyone, a charcoal suit cut close, a watch that had belonged to my father, Shoes I'd kept for exactly this kind of occasion without admitting to myself why. I looked in the mirror and saw a man who had simply put back on something that had always fit. I drove myself downtown, parked 2 blocks from the restaurant, and walked the rest of the way I've always preferred to arrive at anything that mattered. The Aldergate room sat on the 40th floor of a glass tower, all soft light and quieter money than the lobby downstairs let on. Julian Reyes, the private dining director, stood near the entrance checking names against a list. I gave him mine. He looked up, and something crossed his face that had nothing to do with a reservation. It was recognition, brief and immediately controlled, the look of a man deciding in real time how much of what he knew he was permitted to say out loud. He simply nodded and said, "Right this way, sir," with a formality he hadn't used on the 2 guests ahead of me. The room went quiet when I walked in. 16 people at a long table stopped talking mid-sentence, the way a room does when it expects one thing and receives another. Vivian Cross was seated at the head of the table in a dark green dress, mid-laugh at something her chief of staff had said, and the laugh simply stopped on her face without finishing. She looked at me for 3 full seconds before she understood that the man standing in the doorway was the joke she had invited. I let the silence sit there a moment longer than was comfortable, not to embarrass anyone. I have never needed to embarrass anyone to make a point. I let it sit because silence tells you things noise never will, and I wanted to see who filled it first and how. It was Richard Voss, 58, gray at the temples, a man who had clearly decided decades ago that confidence could substitute for correctness. He half rose from his chair and asked, with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes, if I was lost. I told him no. I told him I believed this was the table I was invited to. I said it the way you'd mention the weather, without heat, without apology. And I watched the sentence land differently on different faces around that table. Vivian's chief of staff, Priya, set down her wine glass very carefully, as though the sound of it touching the table might say something she wasn't ready to announce. The joke, whatever it had been meant to accomplish, had already stopped being funny to everyone, except the 2 or 3 people too committed to admit it. I didn't wait for an invitation to sit. There was an empty chair near the middle of the table, clearly meant to place me at a comfortable distance from anyone important, and I took it without complaint. I unfolded my napkin the way I would at any dinner, calm, unbothered, entirely at ease in a room built to make me feel otherwise. That, more than anything I could have said, seemed to unsettle Vivian more than anger would have. She had built her evening around expecting a reaction. I simply didn't give her one. Julian returned a few minutes later to pour water, and when he reached my glass, he said quietly, "It's good to see you again, sir. It's been some time." Vivian's head turned so fast her earring caught the light. She asked him in the particular tone people use when they suspect they've missed something important, how he knew me. Julian hesitated, chose his words with the caution of a man protecting something he wasn't sure he was allowed to protect, and said only that I'd once been a guest whose business he'd had the privilege of handling personally years ago, under different circumstances. He offered nothing further. It was enough to plant the first real question in her mind, and I watched it take root. Dinner proceeded the way these things do when someone is trying to reclaim control of a room that has already slipped from her hands. Vivian introduced me to the table as an unexpected addition, her tone light, performing ease she clearly no longer felt. I let her. I answered when spoken to, asked reasonable questions about people's work, complimented the wine without pretending to know more about it than I did. I was not there to perform. I was there to listen, and listening has always been the thing I do best in rooms full of people who assume the quiet man has nothing worth hearing. It was Richard Voss who gave me my first real opening, though he didn't know it. He began talking about an upcoming acquisition Northbridge was finalizing, a logistics firm out of Ohio, describing the deal structure to the table with the easy authority of a man who had explained it many times before. He mentioned the projected integration timeline, the debt financing terms, and one detail about the target company's existing supply contracts that was, quite simply, wrong. Not wrong in a way most people at that table would catch. Wrong in a way only someone who had actually studied that kind of contract architecture would notice. I corrected him. Quietly, without drama, the way you'd mention a typo. I said the exclusivity clause he'd described didn't typically survive a change of control in agreements structured that way, and that if Northbridge was counting on those contracts transferring automatically, someone should confirm it in writing before the deal closed. I didn't explain how I knew that. I didn't need to. The table went still again, differently this time. The stillness of people recalculating who exactly was sitting among them. Richard's smile thinned. He asked with the forced lightness of a man trying to salvage his own credibility what exactly my background was that I'd know something like that. I told him I'd spent time around businesses that had structured deals badly and paid for it. It wasn't a lie. It also wasn't the whole truth, and I could see in Vivian's eyes that she had already noticed the gap between what I'd said and what I clearly knew. She didn't push further, not yet. She simply filed it away, the way sharp people do, and returned to it later when fewer eyes were watching. She started testing me after that, the way sharp people do when they sense there's more beneath the surface they don't yet understand. She asked about supply chain resilience, about how a company protects itself when a key vendor becomes financially unstable, about what she called soft indicators, the small signs that a business relationship is deteriorating before the numbers confirm it. I answered plainly, giving her real information without theater. And each answer seemed to worry her more than the last, because I wasn't guessing. I was recalling. At one point she asked, almost offhandedly, whether I'd ever advised a company through an actual crisis, the kind where the board starts asking whether the whole thing might not survive the quarter. I told her I had, more than once, though I didn't name which companies or when. She studied me for a long moment, before saying that most consultants she'd met loved to talk about their war stories, loved the sound of their own credentials. She said I was the first person she'd met who seemed to be hiding his the way other people hide something they're ashamed of, rather than something they're proud of. I told her it wasn't shame. It was cost. She didn't ask what I meant by that, not yet, but I could see her holding on to the word. By dessert, Vivian had stopped performing entirely. She leaned forward, elbows on the table in a way I suspected her etiquette coach would have disapproved of, and asked me directly which firm I'd worked with, which industry, which cities. I gave her nothing that would let her place me on a map. She already knew. She tried names, consulting firms, banks, a few well-known turnaround specialists whose reputations had outlived their relevance. None of them fit, and I watched something shift in her face as the mystery stopped being entertaining and started feeling personal. That was when she finally admitted what the dinner had actually been for. She told me, in a voice lowered enough that only the people closest to us could hear, that inviting me had started as a joke. Yes, but that she'd also been hoping, in some half-formed way she hadn't fully examined until that moment, that embarrassing me might rattle something loose. She had heard whispers for months that someone close to her was shaping information before it reached her, and she had run out of people inside the company she trusted enough to ask. She thought a stranger might say something useful if provoked. Instead, she said, "I think you've been the one doing the provoking." I asked her one question in return. Why did you think I wouldn't recognize what was happening the moment I walked in? She didn't answer right away. I watched her realize, in real time, that I hadn't spent the evening as her guest. I'd spent it as an observer, cataloging the room the way I once cataloged failing companies, watching who deferred to whom, who avoided eye contact with her uncle, who flinched slightly whenever Northbridge's numbers came up in conversation. She had built this dinner to expose me. What it had actually done was hand me a seat close enough to confirm what I'd already suspected. I told her, carefully, that the problem inside her company wasn't primarily financial. Someone had been shaping what she saw not through outright fraud, but through the quiet manipulation of context, presenting selective numbers as complete pictures, timing bad news to arrive alongside good news that overshadowed it, routing certain reports through people who had learned exactly what she wanted to hear before she knew she wanted to hear it. It's not one lie, I said. It's a pattern of small omissions that adds up to a false floor under your confidence. I still didn't tell her how I knew. She asked, finally directly, the question I'd been waiting for since I walked through that door. Who are you? Her voice had lost every trace of the amusement it carried when Priya first called me. I told her the truth, in pieces. The way I decided years ago was the only way I could tell it without losing something in the retelling. I told her that decades earlier, I had built a recovery framework, an operational discipline for identifying exactly the kind of quiet failure eating through a company from the inside, and that framework had once kept a company far larger than hers from collapsing entirely. I told her I hadn't done it for recognition, and that recognition had found me anyway, and that it had cost me something I still didn't discuss easily. A partner in that work had taken the credit that mattered most, the kind that opens doors and builds careers, and had built his own reputation on the back of a method he barely understood well enough to explain. I had walked away from that world rather than fight for a name I'd already decided didn't matter as much as I'd once believed it did. I built a quieter life instead. I raised my daughter. I worked with my hands, restoring the kinds of old buildings nobody had asked me to save, and I let the rest of it go. Vivian sat with that for a long moment. Then I told her the part I'd been holding back since I first sat down. The operational framework her own company relied on, the risk architecture her analysts used to flag vendor instability, the very system Richard had cited earlier that evening while getting his own numbers wrong, had been built from principles I originally designed. Northbridge hadn't licensed it directly. It had been passed down through consultants who'd learned it secondhand, stripped of the discipline that made it work, applied without understanding why certain checks existed in the first place. Her company had been running on the bones of my work for years without knowing it, and the version they'd inherited had been weakened exactly where weakness was easiest to hide, in the layer of trusted advisors who decided what reached her desk. That, I told her, was how someone could manipulate her confidence without ever technically lying to her. They didn't need to lie. They only needed to control which true things she saw and in what order. Richard had gone very quiet by then, and I noticed Priya watching him instead of me, the way people watch someone they've started to suspect for reasons they haven't said out loud yet. I didn't accuse anyone directly. I have learned that certainty earned through observation is worth more than an accusation made too early, and I wasn't finished observing. But I could see the shape of it clearly now, the way a familiar pattern reassembles itself once you're finally standing close enough to see all its pieces at once. Vivian asked me, quietly, why I had actually accepted her invitation, given everything I'd just told her. I told her the truth. I hadn't come because she'd invited me as a joke. I'd come because I already suspected something was wrong inside Northbridge before her assistant ever called, and her invitation had simply handed me a reason to sit inside the one room where I could watch the people closest to her without any of them knowing why I was really there. The joke, I told her, had accidentally given me exactly what a formal audit never could. It had given me an evening where no one performed for my benefit because no one believed I was worth performing for. That was the gift of being underestimated. The one thing people never understand about it until they're the ones doing the underestimating. You show a stranger the version of yourself you want them to see. You show someone you've dismissed the version you never bothered to hide. She sat with that for a long time before she spoke again. When she did, her voice had none of the sharpness it carried when she first arrived at that table, none of the performed confidence I imagined she wore into every room she entered. She asked whether I would help her find out exactly how far the manipulation went, and who had built it, and whether it could be undone before it cost her something she couldn't recover from. I told her I would, but that it would mean stepping back into a version of visibility I'd spent years avoiding. I want to be honest about something here. I did not make that decision easily. I have a daughter who worries about me, a quiet life I'd built carefully out of the wreckage of the one I lost, and a genuine fear, older than I like to admit, of what happens when the world remembers what I'm capable of and starts asking for more of it than I'm willing to give. But sitting in that room, watching a 29-year-old woman realize in real time how much of her own company had been hidden from her, I understood something I'd been avoiding for years. Staying invisible had stopped protecting me a long time ago. It had simply started protecting the people misusing what I'd built. I agreed to help her on my own terms, which I laid out plainly before I said yes. I wanted no title, no photograph on a company page, no announcement to a board that would only invite the same kind of attention I'd spent a decade avoiding. I wanted access, discretion, and the authority to say difficult things in rooms where people had grown comfortable not hearing them. She agreed without negotiating, which told me more about her than anything she'd said all evening. It's rare to watch someone give up control that easily, and rarer still for it to mean what it meant when she did it. The weeks that followed were not simple, because nothing worth doing ever is. I went through Northbridge's reporting structure the way I once went through failing companies decades earlier, methodically without urgency, looking not for the lie but for the seam where truth had been quietly narrowed until it fit someone else's convenience. I found what I expected to find. Richard Voss had not committed fraud in any way a courtroom would recognize. He had simply, patiently over years, positioned himself as the filter through which Vivian received certain kinds of information, softening risks that threatened decisions he favored, sharpening ones that threatened decisions he didn't. He had done it carefully enough that no single choice looked wrong on its own. That was the part that told me everything about the man. He wasn't a villain twirling a mustache in a boardroom. He was something more common and more dangerous, a person who had convinced himself that guiding his niece's judgment from the shadows was simply looking out for the family, even as it steadily eroded her ability to see her own company clearly. When Vivian finally confronted him with what I'd found, she didn't do it with anger. She did it the way I'd taught her to, calmly, with evidence laid out plainly enough that argument became pointless. He didn't deny it. Men like that rarely do once the pattern is visible enough that denial would only look foolish. He resigned from his advisory position within the month, quietly with language crafted by lawyers on both sides that protected everyone's dignity except, perhaps, his own. Vivian rebuilt her reporting structure from the ground up that year, this time with real transparency built into it, checks that couldn't be quietly softened by anyone standing between her and the truth. Northbridge posted its strongest quarter in 3 years the following spring, and almost no one outside a small circle ever learned why. I still remember the last conversation Vivian and I had at the Aldergate room, months after that first dinner, back at the same table by coincidence rather than design. She asked me, finally, the question I imagined she'd been holding since the night she first understood who I was. Why hadn't I simply told her the truth from the beginning, walked in, introduced myself properly, offered my help the honest way instead of letting her humiliate herself first? I told Her because if she'd known who I was before that dinner, she would have shown me the company she wanted me to see. The polished version, the rehearsed one, the one built for investors and cameras and men like her uncle who had learned exactly what she needed to hear. I needed to see the company she thought nobody was watching. The version that only reveals itself when everyone in the room believes the quiet older man at the far end of the table doesn't matter enough to perform for. She was quiet for a moment, turning that over the way I'd watched her turn over difficult things all evening the first time we met. Then she said something I've thought about often since. She said, she used to believe that competence announced itself, that the smartest person in any room was usually the loudest one, the most visible one, the one everyone already agreed to watch. She said she didn't believe that anymore. She said the most dangerous mistake a person in her position could make wasn't trusting the wrong people. It was believing she already knew, on sight, who deserved to be trusted at all. I think about that conversation more than I expected to when this all began. I didn't come back into visibility because I wanted recognition. I came back because I understood, sitting in that room the first night, that the quiet life I'd built for myself had a cost attached to it, that I'd stopped counting, and that cost had finally reached someone other than me. My daughter asked me once, not long after, whether I regretted the years I'd spent hidden, working with my hands, letting people believe I was simply an old man who fixed things nobody else wanted to bother with anymore. I told her no. I told her those years taught me something I don't think I could have learned any other way, that dignity doesn't require an audience, and that the habits you keep when no one is measuring you are the only ones that hold up when someone finally does. I wasn't waiting to be discovered at that dinner table. I wasn't hoping anyone would notice. I had simply spent decades being exactly who I already was, patient, observant, unwilling to perform for people who had already decided I wasn't worth the effort. The people who underestimated me were never paying close enough attention to know that. That turned out to be their mistake, not mine. Vivian and I still meet occasionally, not as employer and consultant exactly, something closer to two people who trust the version of each other neither of us built for show. She tells me sometimes that the joke her circle made that night is the single best decision anyone in that company ever made, even though none of them meant it as one. I tell her that's usually how the truth arrives sideways, dressed as something smaller than it turns out to be. Renee met Vivian once, at a small dinner I hosted at my own table for once instead of someone else's. My daughter, who has spent her whole life watching her father choose quiet over recognition, told me afterward that it was strange to finally see a room treat me the way she'd always known I deserved to be treated. I told her it wasn't the room that changed. It was simply the first time in a long while that I'd let it. She said that was the part that mattered most, and I think she was right about that, the way she usually is. If there's anything I'd want someone listening to this to carry away with them, it's that the room you're sitting in right now, the one where you feel invisible, unremarkable, easy to overlook, isn't the whole truth of who you are. It's only the truth someone else has decided to see. What you do in the quiet, when nobody's watching and nobody's applauding, is the only measure that ever really counted. I learned that the hard way once, and I nearly let myself forget it, until a joke meant to humble me reminded me exactly why I'd never needed anyone's permission to matter. I never went looking for that dinner invitation. I never asked to be the joke that got told about behind closed doors weeks before it reached my ears. But I walked through that door anyway, because somewhere underneath the amusement and the assumptions, I heard something true trying to get out, and I decided finally that staying quiet wasn't worth what it was costing someone else to keep me that way. If you've ever been the person a room decided not to take seriously before you'd said a single word, I hope this reminded you of something worth remembering. You already know exactly who you are. Sooner or later, so will they.